Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Hey leaders, thanks for watching the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast for YouTube. This interview was originally broadcast on my other podcast, Church Pulse Weekly. And before we dive into the interview with Andy Stanley, Barna President David Kinnaman and I start by sharing some recent data from church leaders in the midst of this crisis. Hope you find this episode helpful. If you do, leave us a comment or rating and enjoy. And David, here we are well into the fall. The crisis continues strangely. And we want to highlight a couple of the big changes that have happened to leaders. We do weekly polling. If you're new to the podcast, we do weekly polling through Barna every week. And for all of you who continue to participate in that, thank you so much. You can get that at churchpulseweekly.com. Dive right in. But man, things are changing fast, aren't they? And how we're coping with the crisis, David.
Yeah, they really are. And looking forward to hearing from Andy Stanley, as you are as well. Let me frame this as four themes that we've been tracking along. There's many different sort of data points, and we can talk about some of the specifics, but I thought for today's interview, we could sort of frame what we've learned so far in four themes. So let me hit the themes first, and we can drill down on any of them you'd like. But number one, pastors are coming to realize that COVID won't propel spiritual growth as much as they thought it would in the early days of the pandemic. So that is one of the key findings. Like then, week one of the pandemic, 50% of pastors thought it would cause their people's faith journey to increase. Only 1% thought it would decrease. Now, pastors are only slightly more likely to think that the pandemic will increase people's spirituality than to believe it will diminish their spiritual appetite. So huge shift in 4 months about sort of pastors' belief that this is going to be a good thing for spirituality. And that includes their own church. So that's the first theme. The second theme is that pastors are struggling with reopening and with showing what we describe here as a consistent response to government restrictions. So there's this real kind of interesting kind of pastors wanting to have their cake and eat it too kind of feeling here, where as a church leader, it is important to me to lead by example and follow all local or government regulations and recommendations regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. Right at the early days, 9 out of 10 pastors agreed. Today, 9 out of 10 pastors agreed. But also, pastors sort of are holding this perspective that it is important that I do what I think is best for my church, even if that means going against what local or national government officials are saying. And 6 out of 10 pastors agree with that. So there's this real sense of inconsistency that I think pastors are wrestling with, because there's a lot of pressure on them to open or not open, to comply or not comply. And with each passing week, the early days, I think you and I both remarked, it's so fascinating that pastors unanimously followed suit with so many other industries. But there's increasing pressure, political pressure, local pressure to either comply or not comply with government regulations.
So just to underscore that real quick, that's kind of like saying, do you agree that there should be speed limits on the road? And I say yes. And then it's like, and do you speed all the time? And I say yes. Is it a little bit like that?
I think so.
Okay.
And again, I think part of the reason we wanted to raise it, we want to hear from Andy. We want to hear from you as leaders about what you think is the way forward on this. I recognize that there's never been a harder 6 months to be a pastor, a spiritual leader, because you're facing a lot of pressure from a lot of different places. But we're really calling that out, this consistency / inconsistency. So that's the second thing.
A couple more before we bring Andy on, and then I'd love to get his take.
Yeah, the third theme is this idea of the emotional well-being of pastors is flashing red. And lots of different ways we could look at this, but 1 in 5 pastors admits that their emotional well-being is below average or poor, which is double that of the first weeks of the pandemic and 10 times worse than a pastor a few years ago in a normal period of time. So 1 in 5 pastors, 20% of pastors, usually it's just 1% of pastors who say that their emotional well-being is below average or poor. And we're seeing all sorts of interesting ways that, we could sort of say pastors are the essential frontline workers who are also feeling the pressure just as other leaders, healthcare workers, civic leaders. There's a lot of pressure, and we can talk about the emotional thinness of a lot of leaders in this time. So that's the third theme. The fourth theme is that there's a lot of winners and losers when it comes to the COVID crisis among churches. Winners include the technology, church leaders telling us that their own staff, their own lay leaders are stepping up. They're serving the community in ways that they wouldn't have expected. Lots of really cool things. I mean, I think that the hybrid church, the digital church, is here to stay as a result of coronavirus. But losers in this whole equation have been young leaders and reaching the next generation. We've seen a consistent pattern through our nearly 6 months of polling now that reaching younger generations is just not that important. Pastors are telling us they're struggling with that already before the coronavirus. Even now, they're just like, hey, how can we just keep the lights on? How can we keep doing digital church? What we do for millennials, Gen Z, how we will raise young leaders. We'll get to that later. And so I feel like there's going to be a big crisis of transition of leaders as we think about how will there be, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months from now, the right kind of pipeline of young leaders coming in to serve churches to reach younger audiences. I think that's a really critical fourth theme that we're seeing in the data.
Well, I appreciate being able to track the attitudinal shifts and the emotional shifts that are happening as this, what seemed like an acute crisis has become a chronic one. And so with that, let's bring Andy Stanley in. Andy is the senior pastor of North Point Ministries. I think almost every listener knows Andy, author of multiple books, including Deep and Wide and so many others. Andy, welcome. Really glad you're here.
Yeah, I'm pretty depressed.
Well, I've done my job.
You should have done that at the end.
Well, you had a chance to look at all the data we've been tracking, and it tells a story, doesn't it, Andy? I mean, my goodness.
Yeah, it does. It's fascinating, of course, to someone like me who never took a statistics class that you can even gather all that and track it. So David, way to go. Of course, you've been doing that for years. And it's so helpful to those of us out here who are in our bubble, no matter what your bubble's like. You wonder, speaking for your audience, if I can thank you on behalf of us, we wonder, is it just me? And when you find out, no, it's not just you, it's like, oh, well, that's helpful, because you feel like the outlier, especially right now. So, for your audience who's, they have a network of church leaders who are probably kind of like them, like they're all sort of somewhat homogeneous a little bit. And then to find out, oh, this is common to all of us, that's extremely helpful and encouraging. So thank you for, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure. Yeah, it's been fun. I feel like I've been practicing for 25 years of research for this moment because
such a time as this, Esther.
It's a real-time experiment with how quickly things are changing.
Andy, any thoughts on some of the data that David shared or some other things that you read when you looked at the whole picture?
Yeah, you sent it to me earlier today. And okay, this is not helpful, what I'm about to say. So just chalk this up to you're wasting our time. But let me tell you what I thought about when you were talking about the digital piece. And, some churches are getting on board. Some churches, they just never could figure it out, or they're struggling to figure it out, or their folks can't figure it out. My dad turns 88 this month.
Wow.
And he's still the pastor at First Baptist Church of Atlanta. So they made this pivot. Okay, his primarily older church, as you might imagine, First Baptist Church of Atlanta, they have 4,000 folks on a Sunday, adults. They immediately went to Facebook, I guess Facebook Live initially for their services, live streaming on Sunday, and, ready for this, Wednesday night Bible study, streaming live. And most of their large Sunday school departments came together to create several large Sunday school departments that are using Facebook and other technology. And it has been amazing. The participation has been amazing. The consistency has been amazing. They're going through the book of Daniel on Wednesday nights with one of their associate pastors. And, I don't know what's going on in the background, but in terms of their ability to pivot and to, keep people in the pipeline in terms of communication, what's going on in the church, I have been so impressed. So, everybody's figuring this out in their own way. So Wednesday night Bible study is coming back. So
you made national news back in July when you announced that North Point would not be reopening for in-person services until 2021. I would love to figure out if you would share with leaders what factored into that decision, because it really did surprise a lot of people. You were one of the people to go first on that and say, not until next year.
Yeah, there were several things, but first and foremost, to us, this was our, Jesus didn't command a lot of things to the general audience, but one of them was, we're to love as he loved us, and as the Father loved us, through whom we're to love one another, and specifically we're to love our neighbors. And in our world, we're to love our neighborhoods. And so honestly, our very first line of response was, how do we love our neighbors and how do we love our neighborhoods? And we'll talk about this, I guess, not what is best for us as a local church, but what's best for our neighbor and our neighborhoods. And it was a very short discussion that, in terms of not wanting to be a super spreader, and again, this is not one size fits all. Every community is different, but in the state of Georgia, in the city of Atlanta in particular, our numbers were going the wrong way, and they were going the wrong way quickly. And so when we kind of went first and didn't take it week by week, we can talk about that, or even, month by month, but to say, hey, we're just boom, we're going to make one decision, not 100 decisions. It took some people by surprise. Honestly, I was so shocked it made any news, much less national news, because it was a decision for our Atlanta area network of churches. We've not looked back. We've not second guessed that. And the other thing it did for me, and Carey, you know me really well, when I put on my leadership hat, I have about 550 staff. I didn't want them waking up every Monday wondering, is this the week we open? Is this the week we open? Is this the week? My responsibility as a leader was to bring clarity to this uncertainty. And by bringing clarity to the uncertainty, then I can turn around and say, okay, here's what we're not going to do, but here's what we can do, because here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to be in the here comes Sunday world for any longer. So with all this extra time and all this staff and our limited resources, what can we do now that we've never been able to do before? So the geeky leader part of me was kind of excited about breaking out of this routine and giving our staff permission to do something different. But we couldn't do that if we were week to week or even month to month. So creating these, clearing the decks for these large blocks of time has been extraordinary in terms of releasing creativity and some innovation and discovering new opportunities.
And when you made that decision, Andy, our tracking showed that it was either 0% or just a single percent of people that were waiting until next year to declare going back to sort of in-person worship. But over about 6 weeks, it went to about last time was 18%. Now it's 15%. So 1 in 6 churches currently are expecting to wait until 2021. And I think that idea of being clear in the midst of uncertainty really makes a difference for a lot of leaders and for people that are waiting to know just what's next.
Well, or I've just been a bad example. Thank you. We'll see, right? Time will tell.
I like your analysis of making one decision that kind of freed you up from making 100 or 1,000 little decisions. I think that's really sharp leadership. I'd love to know, Andy, what do you think that cost you, if you think it cost you anything, and what do you think it gained you? Because you're right, you don't make national news or catch headlines just because, that decision cost him nothing. I would imagine in the minds of a lot of pastors, they're like, wow, that's pretty risky. So what did you think you were giving up, and what did you think you would gain? Well,
honestly, at the time, I didn't even think about what we were giving up, because I was so excited about the opportunity to do something different. But here's what I did give up. We surveyed our folks, and of course, we got some immediate feedback from insiders. And there was about 15% of people who I would say were committed to one of our churches who were not happy. They weren't happy about the decision to shut down for the summer, or when I say shut down, to suspend weekend worship services for the summer. And then when we said, hey, for the rest of the year, I got voicemail, letters, email, people putting letters in my mailbox. And so here's what I did, and this is my habit. And Diane knows whenever I get a complaint that she hands to me, she has already gone ahead and looked up a cell phone number. I do not write people. I don't respond with email. I call people. So I call just about every single person who in our church who's, we went online. These are people who are committed. They've led small groups. They love our church, but they are upset. And you will not be surprised to know, and I've shared this with our church. I wouldn't share anything here I haven't shared with our church. 100% of the negatives 100% of the negatives. They weren't, oh, I miss the church so much and I can't wait and I'm so upset that I can't gather with Christians on Sunday to worship God. There was zero of that. 100% of the pushback was political in nature. We bought into this Democratic lie. We bought into the scamdemic. These were actually friendly conversations. I mean, first of all, they weren't even sure it was me. I had to convince them, no, this is really Andy. I got your email. I actually read it. And then they would tell me how much they loved the church and how it changed their life. So we'd go through all those wonderful things. And then we would kind of get into the nitty gritty. And honestly, these are people who like, I'm not wearing that mask. I've not quarantined one single day. I don't know anybody who's gotten sick. This is just people trying to shut down the church. So we have those folks in our churches. And I talk to them, and we've had interesting conversations. And some of them were saying, we're leaving the church. And I would say, well, this is actually a great time to leave the church because we're not meeting. And the churches you probably would want to go to, they're not meeting either. Then we would laugh, and hopefully nobody left the church. I don't want anybody to leave the church. So that wasn't exactly surprising once I got into it, but I was not anticipating that. Again, I just was excited about doing the right thing for our community. And, when you do something very, very big and different, everybody stops and looks, and then you have to decide, what are we going to do with this attention? And can we leverage it in such a way that increases our influence in the community and our community knows, hey, this church is for our community. I'll tell you where I got consistently good feedback was from the medical community. I heard from people literally all over the country who said, Andy, I don't go to your church, or Andy, I've read one of your books, I watch you on Sunday, or Andy, you don't know me, but my wife's a nurse, I'm a nurse, and my wife's a doctor, you've made the right decision. And in some cases, they were quick to say, I'm a very right-wing Republican. I want you to know that. But yeah, I feel like you made the right decision because, people sense that this has become politicized like everything has. So that's been an interesting thing to navigate, but I've had some fascinating conversations along the way.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so helpful because I'm sure our leaders listening have had so many of those conversations. Andy, you're right. We have known each other for a long time, and I've had the privilege of sitting down so many times and benefiting from your teaching. One of the things I would say, you're one of the best, if not the best I know at this, but you have figured out how to say no. You figured out how to handle critical feedback, I think, better than anybody. Can you just give us a glimpse into the emotional process you walk through when Diane shows up and says, Andy, you got 746 emails with people who are mad at you this morning. Like, what happens to you when that happens?
Carey, this is a little bit of personality, so I don't know that there's anything transferable about what I'm about to say. Part of it's being a preacher's kid. I feel like I've lived my life twice. I experience so much of what I saw my dad experience as a kid. I think that helps tremendously. But here's the thing. When I'm certain, or when I'm confident, I guess is a better word, when I'm confident that I've made or we've made the right decision, I get credit for a lot of decisions that there was a we, not just a me, but somebody has to be the point person. When I'm confident that we've made the right decision, then I'm almost excited about talking to my critics because in my naivety or my arrogance, you can decide, I am convinced that I can convince them to see this my way because I'm confident it's the right thing to do. And if we can just have a conversation, they'll at least go, well, okay, I hadn't thought about that, or what, that is a different perspective. It's one of the reasons, and I would highly recommend, I don't recommend my sermons, but after I had a lot of these conversations, I actually came back and preached an entire message entitled Not in It to Win It, Not in It to Win It, where I addressed this to our whole congregation to say, hey, we're in a cancel culture, and some of you canceled me. When you found out we weren't going to meet, it was like, we're done. And you talked about years and years and years of how much you love our church, but one sermon or one decision, and boom, you're out. So I just addressed it head on with our congregation because in this particular case, I believe there is a theological reason for us in our cities in the state of Georgia to make this decision because it says something about the gospel and it says something about the positioning of the church. So this wasn't just let's do something different. I feel like there are theological underpinnings, at least for us. And so if there's pushback, in my way of thinking, it becomes an excuse to talk about it more. And hopefully, we all learn together. So that's sort of been my response to criticism. Again, I don't know if there's any takeaways from that or not.
No, it's super helpful. One of the things that you have said repeatedly at church, also on your leadership podcast and the different platforms through the pandemic, is clarity when you don't have certainty. I would love to know, what are the rhythms, the disciplines, because you are clear, like you've always been clear, but because it's such a confusing time, what are the disciplines, the rhythms, the thought patterns, the process you use personally to find clarity when there isn't a lot of clarity?
Well, I have lots of conversations with lots of people. This decision to, not have to suspend weekend worship services, beginning at the end of July through the rest of the year. 90% of the people that were in that room, but there were 15 people in that room, all of our lead pastors, our NPM directors. And I threw out several options. There were, none of them I thought were good options, but I didn't walk in with an idea and say, here's what I think we should do. Let's talk about it. I walked in, I threw the net as wide as I possibly could, because they're smart people. And I had an intuition about what I thought we should probably do. But actually, Clay Scroggins, he's probably been on this program. Clay was the first person after we talked not that long that said, I just think we should not plan to open for the rest of the year. And I just looked around the room, and it was a pretty short meeting. So I don't know that I'm a consensus builder, but I am really, really interested in what other people are thinking and how other people are processing. And then at some point, when you get to about 85% confidence, you just have to make a decision and move forward. But in terms of the clarity, and this is so important, so just stop me, David or Carey, either one of you, if I go too long on this. When there is uncertainty, the clarity is basically giving people something to do. Because when things are uncertain and disruptive, nobody knows what to do. They know what they used to do. They know what they thought they should do. So you don't bring certainty into uncertainty. You bring clarity around, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do for now. Here's what we're going to do until then. And so putting a date out there, clearing the decks and saying, we're going to come up with a new strategy, a new plan. Here's what we can do. Here's what we can do now. Because if you don't give people something to do and they don't know what to do, they will intuitively focus on all the wrong things because you haven't given them anything to focus on. It's not their fault. So it's so important in uncertainty for the leader to have something to point the organization toward and specifically give them something to do. And again, if you have smart people, they're pretty much going to take it from there. So that was, and if you don't give some people something to do, then as you know, nothing gets done. And so we basically asked the question, we know what we're not going to do, but let's not focus, and this is important, let's not focus on what we can't do or what we're not going to do. Let's focus on the new opportunities that we didn't have before. Let's focus on what we can do. And our staff they have the time and the flexibility to try some new things that I think, and you know this, to do some things that are going to carry forward into whatever the future looks like. And I think a lot of churches are discovering that. But again, it begins with clarity in terms of the decision, and then clarity in terms of, what do we do now and where do we go from there? And again, I didn't answer all the questions for everybody. I don't know all the answers, but I at least came up with hey, here's two things we can all do. Let's get busy.
So the three of us are sitting here with decades of experience in leadership and research. I sort of said earlier, I've spent 25 years practicing for this moment. And I think some of the clarity that you're giving to your community comes from a lot of practice of leading. Speak to the leaders who are, maybe 5 years or less, who've planted a church or who are trying to figure out, like, what am I supposed to learn during this moment? How do I stay in the game? How do I think about, learning the right habits? Like if I were a brand new researcher, I wouldn't know how to do the right kind of research at this moment. So what would you say to young leaders about trying to sustain themselves and their churches and their leadership through this crisis?
I don't know. For a church plant, I've talked to a couple of leaders of networks of church plants who've called me, and I'm like, Come on, we all know church planting is tough when things are great. Church planting through this. But so this is not going to answer your question, but here's something that I've been thinking about. And in fact, I told our team this. I said, you watch, this is when the insurgents are going to surface. Because while the rest of us are carrying a model that we're trying to sustain. So think about a church planter. They planted with a model, a good model, perhaps, maybe a perfect model. Suddenly the model is not sustainable in this climate. But what is their natural inclination? I got to figure out how to sustain this model. Well, that's the wrong way to think, but it's the natural way to think. And because they don't have a different model, again, they become very insider focused. How do we get enough money to sustain this model? How do I keep people involved? But I guarantee you, in fact, you guys may already know, because no names come to mind, but I know they're out there. There are some young leaders who are going to be the insurgents. They're going to quit. They're going to shut down all their video stores, and they're going to quit sending DVDs, and they're just going to start streaming and put everybody else out of business. There are insurgents that have been playing with the rules, breaking the rules, playing around the edges, and their time has finally come, because the old models, not only are they not going to work well, here's the real challenge. Those of us who have built these models, birthed these models, made a career and a reputation out of these models, it's very difficult for us to let them go, because this is what we do. But the leaders and the church leaders who are not emotionally connected to those models, I've told our staff, I've taught this for years. I've said, we may not be the ones that come up with the next iteration, but we better keep our hands wide open. We better stay in love and married to our mission. We better not marry our model, because the models are going to change. And I think on the backside of this are going to be some new church models that this season fueled. And as a seasoned leader, I want to be a part of that. And I don't want to be so married to what we do financially or in terms of a staffing structure that not only do I miss it, but here's the thing I really don't want to do. I don't want to criticize it, because it doesn't fit with what I built my reputation around. And so for the young leaders out there who, again, they planted a church a year ago, 6 months ago, based on a church planning model that used to work, I would say to you, hey, I can't give you the specifics of what you should do, but this is the time. This is the time when all those crazy ideas that the people older than you said, that's never going to work. This may be the time to try those things, because it may be the only thing that works going forward.
For our listeners, one of the most important messages I heard in my life happened to come from you, Andy, at one of the catalysts. I don't think I've ever told you this, that you talked about Daniel. He goes to Nebuchadnezzar and he says, God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and he gives them to whom he wishes. And I remember as a youngish leader at the time, just thinking about what that might mean, and promotion comes from the Lord, and leaders challenge the process. So I love that you're talking about this idea of new things happening. Isaiah 43:19, behold, I'm doing a new thing, and now it springs up. So I love that you gave input both for young leaders to go ahead and be the kind of kingdom insurgents that create these new approaches, and then also some advice for those of us on the other side of success who need to be careful not to criticize and sort of push out those new models from changing our mental habits and approaches. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the benefits of clarity too. It's funny how many times I go back and I remember that message. I remember some others you gave, your momentum talk, probably my favorite talk ever on momentum, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Andy, you raise a really good point. The model that you have spent your entire life building up, perfecting, polishing, just kind of out the window with everybody else's model back in March, right? When the virus hit. I would love to know, and you can answer this personally or strategically or professionally, however you want, but what have been some of the hardest parts of these last 6 months for you?
Yeah, personally, this completely disrupted my rhythm, which at first I liked, because I like change. And honestly, at this season of my life, if Sandra were here, she would just nod. As much as I love what I do, and as much as I love who I get to work with, and as much as I love our church, and as much as I love preaching, our church will be 25 years old in October, but it's here comes Sunday, here comes Sunday, here comes Sunday, the next series, the next, So for all of that to get thrown up in the air, at first I'm like, I didn't want to say it too loud because I know people have suffered, right? I mean, people are dying. We have some horrible, horrible stories in our churches. But in terms of the disruption of the schedule, it was like, wow. But then I had such a hard time finding my new rhythm. You know Joel Thomas.
Yeah, very well.
I was the lead pastor here for many years. I called Joel. No, he texted me. He said something along the lines of, this isn't a direct quote, but basically, I don't know what to do. I'm like, me neither. There's so much that needs to be done. My routine is so messed up. And I am honestly, I feel like I'm busier than ever, but part of it is just the routine. So that's the personal side. Our daughter got married in the middle of this. That was interesting. And it has been challenging to know how to lead our staff because I don't see our staff very often. We opened up the offices for a while. We had several staff members test positive, shut them back down temporarily. People can kind of come and go at will, but in terms of in-person meetings, all those things, leading people that you don't see very often, that's been challenging. And this goes back, I think, a little bit to why pastors emotionally are where they are right now, as you mentioned earlier. It's hard to know what is the win, and it's hard to know if we're winning, and it's hard to know how to measure success. And so for entrepreneurial leaders or for people who are fueled to some level by success, suddenly you don't know how to measure it anymore. You don't know if you're being successful. You don't know if you're winning. And this is just a thought. I don't have anything to back this up. Honestly, I think for some pastors, this is why they are so anxious to start meeting again. And I'm not being, I have nobody in mind, okay? But if your sense of worth and self-esteem and success, and I'm a pastor and these are my people and this is my church, if all of it revolves, or if most of it revolves around that hour and 10 minutes on Sunday morning or those 2 hour and 10 minute sessions on Sunday morning, and suddenly you're not doing that anymore, it would make sense, wouldn't it? It would make sense that you would want that back, granted, for the benefit of the congregation, but for the benefit of the man or woman in charge who wants to know, or do we even have a church anymore? So, and I'm not being critical. I just think that's human nature. We are designed to do something, and when we can't do it anymore, we just don't feel successful. So I think that is where some people have taken a hit emotionally. Now, personally, I'm not wired that way. There's nothing in me that misses getting up on a stage and talking to lots and lots of people. I want our organization to thrive. And so I've had to figure out different ways to measure our success and help our staff determine what is a win in this season. Because if they don't know what the win is, then once again, they find themselves not knowing what to do. So those have been, some of the tensions that we're still playing in right now. That's not in the rearview mirror.
And there may not be a clear answer to this, but how have you redefined the win? I mean, you wrote a book on it. If you look at the 7 practices, right, it's define the win. Yeah. What are some of the new wins for you, or have you clarified them yet in this season?
Yeah. So the wins are going to be, they're not campus specific, but they are environment specific. So we've said to middle school, what does the win look like in this season? To high school, what does the win look like? To groups, what does the win look like? So you got to, again, the rule, we're playing by a different set of rules. So in this season, what is the win? So each one of our big areas or big departments has come up with what they feel like the win is. And what's so great, because they're leaders, is once they've, it's the problem with goal setting is you think, what if I set the wrong goal? Because then I'll move in the wrong direction. And I've told them there's no wrong win. Just determine, take a guess, and then agree on it, and then strategize toward it. And whenever you do that, even if it's not the perfect win, at least the ship starts moving in a direction. And it's, you can't change the direction of something that's not moving. It is better to move in the wrong direction and make course changes than to sit back out of fear, like, oh, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do. What if we do the wrong thing? So I'm like, no. You decide, what is the win for middle school? What's the win for parents? This is one of our big discussions right now, because in all of our churches, who feels the most pressure right now in the cities where the schools are either not open, partially open, might close? It's parents. So we're having lots of conversations. So our staff came to me and said, Andy, we want you to do a parenting series. And I'm like, of all the topics, a parenting series? And they're like, yes, nobody needs more attention right now than the parents in our church. I'm like, okay, let's do it. Well, all of that came as a result of them asking the question, what's the win in our different divisions and departments? So that's kind of a short, or maybe not so short, answer to the question. But every church and every pastor, you got to sit down with your staff and determine what is the win for us in this season. Now, let me back up to a little. This goes back to something we talked about earlier that I didn't want to keep harping on. This is one of the primary reasons, and this is going to sound like I'm being critical of other churches, and I promise I'm not. This is one of the big reasons I did not want us to open partially with mask and social distancing, because to me, that is a half measure. That is not a win. People are like, we want to come back to church. And when they come back, it's not the church they left. It's not what they're looking forward to. But it would take money, resources, time, extra cleaning, scale down volunteers. That decision to partially open would take so much of our resources, time, and attention. We would not be able to do some of the other things we're doing. And to me, that was not a win. To just have kids in a classroom with somebody who's not their small group leader and there's no relationship, not a win. To have music and worship, I've participated in online, and I have friends who have opened that they, 3 weeks later, they're like, we should have never opened. They don't even enjoy their own, they're not enjoying their own church. So that was, again, the whole what is the win question for us. That was one of the reasons we decided not to do hybrid church. But again, it's given us the freedom to do some other things. And again, that sounds like a knock. Just to put that in context, Carey, Sean C. at Athens Church.
Yeah.
About a month ago, they decided to open with social distancing and mask. And he asked me, is that okay? I'm like, of course it's okay. Athens, Georgia is a different community than the communities we have around Atlanta. Absolutely. This is not one size fits all. And if that's a win for your church and a win for your community, and of course, Sean, he's the most creative and appropriately ambitious pastor that you'll ever meet. So that was a win for them. So, hey, Go for it.
Yeah, but he has his own criteria. You have yours. Before we started recording, we were chatting a little bit about speaking to an empty room. And David and I, as I'm sure you have heard from so many preachers who are like, I just miss the feedback, like the real feedback. What has that adjustment been like for you, Andy?
Well, again, I like change. I like any communicator, you get in a rut. And so I'll tell you what I've done. The first 2 or 3 weeks, I tried preaching like I normally preach. And it was hard and it was horrible. And I thought, I'm not going to keep doing this because I'm not looking forward to it. So I manuscript after, I think the Sunday before Easter, and from then on, I manuscript my entire sermon and I read the whole sermon off a teleprompter, 100%. And I've gotten better, and I've got some people around me. In fact, one of them is sitting in the room with me right now who would say, Andy, when you do this or when you do that, or Sandra would say, hey, no, I'm like, I want to get so good at this that no one knows I'm reading it. And so I've gotten better and better and better. So for the last whatever months, so it's a whole different preaching style.
How has that? That's really interesting. I don't want to interrupt you, but like you are, because I've read some of your outlines before and they're available, and you're like super detailed, but you've never been a manuscript person. Yeah. What advantage do you think that gives you?
Well, I don't have to pretend that there's anybody in the room, because here's what's happened, and this is very important. I know nobody's going to like this language, but if nobody is in the room, you are creating a television show. So own that and just do it, and don't try to do, we're going to do it like there's people in the room. Everybody on the other end of the camera knows there's nobody else in the room. So don't pretend there's other people in the room. And Brad Bretz, who is sitting in the room with me today, and Brad and I have had to go round and around a couple times because he'd have all these really cool shots. And I'm like, Brad, I want to look down the barrel of the lens because I'm talking to people at home or on their phone or driving. I don't want any more cool jib shots and cool. I mean, it is very cool, but clearly, it's like, who's he talking to now? There's nobody in the room. So it took us a little bit, all of us, our whole team, to finally own the fact we are creating a news show. We are talking to people at home. So let's talk to the people at home. and not talk to the people at home like this. So, but that was an adjustment. And so I would say to the folks, who are listening, because we're all in this world together, if you don't have people in the room, own it. In fact, we took out, 15, we took out basically all the chairs on the floor in our East Auditorium and just created a television studio because, hey, we're creating a television program. This is 100%, video. Nobody's in the room. Again, it took us a little while to, quit trying to do a hybrid and just own it. So I've become a news reader, except, in my case, it's a sermon.
We've been seeing this in the data, actually, that 1 in 3 practicing Christians has sort of been sitting out the coronavirus in terms of church attendance. They haven't been going back, and they haven't even really. They watched a few weekends of the digital church, and they're like, all right, this is not going to be for us. And half of millennials, and I actually think some of the conversations we've been having on this podcast, as well as the data, is showing that, especially for younger viewers, they're so used to YouTube and screen-based media, all of which is based on that sort of expression of trust and value. I remember talking to my son once, actually, where he was more likely to ascribe trustworthiness to a YouTube channel host that he listens to than the youth pastor at our church. And it was this really interesting sense of how do you develop trust across a screen? And I think this is a real-time experiment for those of us in communication and certainly in spiritual work and trying to see, the gospel go forward in some new and fresh ways. I think we have a lot to learn in this moment. And I'm appreciating hearing your sort of insider story about trying to experiment with that.
Yeah. Well, David, let me say one thing about that. And here's my theory, because all of us have had this experience. You're talking to 2 or 3 friends about a topic, and then somebody in the conversation says, well, I read. And as soon as somebody says, I read, the fact that it was written down gives it credibility. This is true for video as well. This is why we all have a tendency to trust almost anybody on the other end of a camera more than we do a person in the room. I don't know what the psychology is behind this, but there is a credibility factor of anybody on the other end of a camera or something that's written. Because, we've all read stuff that's kind of garbage, but there's something about, here's this article or here's this book. Well, the fact that somebody wrote it, it just carries more weight.
It legitimizes it, yeah.
Yeah, it legitimizes it. And so we should take, as communicators and as leaders, we should definitely look for ways to take advantage of that. And we don't have any choice right now, right?
And I absolutely think that this is a gift to the church, because it turns out that all the legitimacy we think we had when people were in the room wasn't actually as deep as we expected it to be in other facets of their lives. So this is forcing the church out of the walls of sort of the church in real ways, but also to actually do ministry through screens in a more holistic way. I've used this line that we're sort of doing analog or at best dial-up ministry in a Wi-Fi world. And for this next generation, an hour or 2 a week isn't going to do it. So we've got to find better and different ways of doing ministry and communicating in a way that people really trust. They don't go fact check you and hey, this isn't really true.
Yeah.
So Andy, I imagine at some point 2021 is going to hit, and at some point in the future, churches may reopen. I know. And I want to pivot the conversation toward reopening. So I think, the data all shows it, the data that David's collecting, Barna's collecting. You've seen it with your friends too. The return to church for churches that have reopened has been, I think, shockingly low. I don't think anyone would have said, oh my goodness, it's going to be this bad. And yet it is. If you have 50% of what you used to get, you're on the winning side at this point. But, I want you to imagine when North Point reopens, there's a vaccine, let's say there's no masks, there's no more need for social distancing, and that'll be a great day. What are you preparing yourself for and North Point Ministries for? Do you anticipate we're going to return to where it was in 2019? You think it'll be bigger, lower? How will the model evolve and morph, and what are your expectations as you get ready for that? I'm asking you to be a prophet, so.
No, well, again, that is the question most church leaders are asking.
Yeah.
I'm asking a different question. I've said to our staff, don't think in terms of getting back to normal. Think in terms of starting over. This is our opportunity to start over. If there was anything we didn't want to do in the past, we don't have to do it anymore. Service times, locations, we get to start over. We're not starting back up. We are starting over. Now, running on the parallel track of what do we do right now between now and the time we're actually back in the building, along with conversations about starting over, once again, we have 5 months to work on that. We have 5 months to figure out what are we doing now and what's it going to look like, not when things go back to normal. I've tried to erase that kind of conversation from our meetings. No, not when we start back up. Let's start over. We have been given the opportunity of a lifetime. In fact, my dad and I have had this. I've had this conversation with the pastor that's going to take his place when he steps down, and I've told him, his name's Anthony. I said, "Man, you got it made because you get to start. You don't have to shut anything down. It's all God shut it all down. So when we come back, I think it's a mistake in any industry or capacity not to at least have the conversation of what if we thought more in terms of starting over than starting back up. And I'm telling you, you have that conversation with your staff, everybody is engaged. Once you have the conversation about, and think about it, you guys are in this world. If you have the conversation of how do we start things back up, you immediately throw everybody back into the old paradigm. It's not exciting. It's more of the same. But to your point, Carey, I wonder how many people are going to show up. It's not going to be like it used to be. Okay, I don't want to have that conversation. Let's have the start over conversation. And if we start over and we start over smaller with a better model that takes into consideration all of this learning, that's exciting to me. So it's just which question do we want to lead with as we think about the future?
Pastors told us that they see the spirituality and engagement of their people the first few weeks that was like sky high. They're like, this is going to be the greatest thing for the church. And now pastors are realistically setting in for a long haul for the chronic nature of this. Speak to your hope of what this pandemic will do for the church, and really what does this mean in the long run, you think, for leaders and for the witness of the church and for the hope of the gospel in our communities?
Oh, see, thank you, David. And I heard two different questions. I want to go with the latter, and we've already talked a little bit about this. You know what? I just taught on this from Acts chapter 11 when the church in Antioch finds out there's going to be an empire-wide famine. It's going to, go throughout the empire. And their first question wasn't, what's God up to and what about us? Their first question was, who's going to be most negatively affected and what can we do? Who's going to be most negatively affected and what can we do? Oh, the Christians in Jerusalem are going to be most negatively affected. They can't get jobs as it is. Most of them are starving. So let's do something for them. Which was unprecedented in the ancient world. 300 miles away, that's like New Zealand, basically from where I live in terms of travel back then. So in terms of our witness, as long as, and again, I've got some staff sitting in here with me today. We've been talking about this. If we can stay outwardly focused in all of our decisions, this is our opportunity to, again, take advantage of this difficult time to say something to our community specifically about how much we care for them and that we are for them. We're not just trying to batten down the hatches and have church the best that we can and try to get back to normal. So in terms of our witness, again, there are unprecedented opportunities. And this is one of the reasons, I know we don't want to get into this, this whole thing that has been so politicized about, they're trying to shut down the churches. Nobody is trying to shut down the church in the United States of America. People in other countries that are actually persecuted I hope they never even hear about it. It is so insulting. Nobody is trying to shut down the church. We should take advantage of the fact that we can't do what we used to do the way we used to do it. And if we do, I do think that the church is going to be better for it. Now, in terms of the spiritual condition of people or people's faith, again, I'm a bit of an optimist in this. In fact, Stuart Hall, I know you guys know Stuart. Stuart just preached. I asked him to preach a couple of messages for us on the question of certainty. He almost died of COVID. What this does, or what disruption like this always does, is it kicks out all the false props. Most of us, our faith isn't in God. Our faith is in the hope that God will come through for us, really. And I don't know that you can get past that until all the false hopes are kicked away and there's nothing but God. So in the midst of a situation like this, there are people who are finding hope literally actually in God rather than hope in the fact that I hope God comes through for me. So that's purifying. I mean, that's what Peter said. Hey, your faith is being purified by fire and people are going to notice. Jesus said, hey, let your light shine in such a way that people see your good works and then glorify your Father in heaven. So these are opportunities, but the churches that are going to get it right are not the churches that turn inward, circle the wagons, batten down the hatches. Let's just get through this till we can get back to normal. They will have missed an extraordinary, extraordinary opportunity. And I'm trying to lead with that posture in our staff meetings and in terms of how we're budgeting and how we're, again, approaching and being involved in the community.
I so appreciate, Andy, you talking about not going back to normal. I resonate with that. And Jeff Brody, my successor, who we're a partner church of North Point, he's actually talking internally about relaunching the church, that this is we're going to launch it. We're not going to open it. We're not going to regather. We're going to launch it. And you may not be able to answer this with specifics, but I want to ask it anyway, because you've had a few months and you got a few months left until you open up. But are there some things that you're like, yeah, we're probably not going to do that again? And boy, I'm really excited about possibly doing this. Are you able to pull the curtain back a little bit to see what's in your mind?
Nope.
I knew that was a good chance of an answer.
But of course there's that stuff. And those are conversations that are going on. And again, Carey, you've heard everything I had to say. I used to do this talk about the old couch. Everybody has a couch and they move the couch. They keep moving the couch. It needs to be thrown away, but we fall in love with the couch. We just keep moving it from house to house to house. And then one day somebody comes in and comments on it, how ugly it is. And you're like, you're right. That is ugly, but I've been moving that thing around. So now's the time to look around at our ministries, our model, our everything and say, hey, we got any old couches that this is the time to just, throw them out or do something different. So yeah, there's all kinds of interesting conversations going on right now. And again, I sound like a broken record. We have time. We have margin. And hopefully we're going to take advantage of it and, again, reopen stronger and better than ever is my hope.
Well, Andy, I think you've already done this once or twice in the conversation, but is there any question that leaders should be asking that you don't hear us asking enough right now?
Well, this is personal. So for most pastors, what I'm about to say is so intuitive for you. It's embarrassing that I even have to admit this, but because I love progress and because I love our organization, the thing that I've had to remind myself of consistently is that in times of uncertainty, our voice is more important than our words, and our presence is more important than our preparation. And I am a preparation addict. If I'm not prepared, I don't show up. If you don't send me the questions ahead of time, I'm not doing the interview.
No interview. Yeah.
Yeah. That's just how I'm wired. And during this season, I have had to be very intentional. And I've given people permission to remind me, Andy, set that aside. Don't text her, call her. Don't email him, call him. Okay, you're not going to be prepared, but this is an important conversation. Go have the conversation. So to, lead with my humanity a little bit more than I'm normally, that I'm accustomed to doing and that I'm even comfortable doing. Again, there are some pastors listening. They're like, are you kidding? I mean, you're a far better pastor than I will ever be. When I show up at the hospital, people just assume it's worse than the doctor told them. Okay. I'm not a comforting presence. But during this season, again, words are more important. You're hearing your voice more important than reading your words and your presence. I just remind myself, preparation's important, but it's not the most important thing. Lead with your humanity because these are uncertain times.
Well, David, anything else? This has been so rich Andy, you've been so generous with your time. Thank you.
I've just been taking mental notes here about different leadership lessons for me here at Barna, and just thinking about what it means for us to have a compelling vision of where we're trying to lead the church and lead our people, as opposed to just trying to manage our way through all the hassles, and sort of feels like the last 6 months have been a game of whack-a-mole for me. And, so this idea of leading towards a preferable future is a great reminder for us as leaders.
I think we all feel that a little bit, David. So yeah. And hey, thank y'all for what you're doing. And thanks for what you do is a gift to the church all the time. But again, as we talked about at the very beginning, it's as or more important than it's ever been before. So thanks for reminding us that we're not alone, that we're not crazy, and that we're all, feeling pretty much the same thing, which means we're healthy and we're normal.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great gifts of research, is to hear someone else's perspective and feel like you're not alone. So thanks for saying that. Appreciate it.
Well, Andy, we're grateful for your voice, for your leadership, and also for your friendship. And to all of you who tuned in Church Pulse Weekly this week, thank you so much for watching. We're so thrilled. We're going to do this, every week, and we'll bring you the latest insights and leaders like Andy Stanley. So if you haven't subscribed yet and you're listening by podcast, please do so wherever you listen to podcasts. And we would love to get your input on the weekly poll. The more you tell us, the more we can help. So if you would head on over to churchpulseweekly.com, just let us know how it's going, the good, the bad, the ugly. It helps us all get better. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Church Pulse Weekly. Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.